Hello, it's the Culture Genie, and today we are going to discuss anachronistic theory and why Peter Zeihan is wrong. For those that are not in the know, anachronism is the concept of placing phenomena in historical context where they don't belong, discussing events or ideas that didn't exist at the time as if they did exist at that time, or discussing things that no longer were relevant in a later time period, as if they were the same as what had been previously the case. And it is this use of anachronistic thinking that we are going to discuss with regard to Peter Zeihan's ideas about Russian aggression. Peter Zeihan, who is a famous geopolitical analyst, and has made a lot of theoretical ideas and prophecies about the future. And I'm going to disregard his prophecies about greater trade impacts or the development of globalism, to focus upon his use of geographical theories to explain Russia's behavior and recent aggression against Ukraine. Peter Zeihan's idea about Russia's aggressive and imperialist nature is that Russia feels insecure, as Russia is exposed very easily to invasions and has had a long history of being invaded by foreign invaders through various gaps or invasion routes. And thus Russian foreign policy has always historically focused upon plugging these gaps or choke points in order to stop any potential future invasions. And these gaps are, amongst some of them, the German-Polish gap on the flats that lead into Ukraine and Russia. And then there are the gaps where Romania is, and the Caucasus Mountains, and also some gaps or choke points in the Asian corridor, where it would be easier to defend against invasions. The idea is that these places are points where it would be so much easier to defend against invasions, that Russia need to expand into these points in order to get secured borders, where they are no longer threatened to be invaded. Peter Zeihan, in his arguments, is inspired by historical thinking and theories that were very popular in the 50s and 60s before the culture turn, when there was a focus upon geography and material factors that determined history. Zeihan refers to history a lot and uses historical examples a lot to argue his case, which is actually kind of good in a way, that he can cross borders from his modern day geopolitics and take inspiration from history and its theories. I myself is a proponent of cross-disciplinary theories and the like, and I think it's very important to do what he is trying to do, but I think he has done it badly, and I will explain why. I'm not saying that any of the theories that were used back in the 50s and 60s to explain Russian history are wrong, rather they have been misapplied in today's world. Even if we disregard the counter-arguments about Russia being easy to invade, for example mentioning that Russia actually does have a lot of geographical barriers, such as harsh winters, muddy spring and autumns, and forests and bogs that can hinder troop movements, and thus hinder invasions quite easily, in fact, especially combined with scorched earth. If we ignore those things and just focus on the theory of Peter Zeihan in itself, and accept that Russia is easy to invade if these choke points are not controlled, then I would say that the problem is that Peter Zeihan's thinking regarding this issue is based upon thinking regarding armies from the early 20th century and earlier, before nukes, as nukes makes these choke points obsolete, as anything that could threaten Russia conventionally to such a degree that these choke points would be needed and actually determine a war would mean that Russia is so threatened to that degree where nukes would be the natural option in a war scenario. And thus anyone that would go and try to invade Russia with that sort of force that would make these choke points necessary would face nukes and probably use nukes themselves, thus making these choke points unnecessary as they would not protect against a real nuclear war. And considering that no one would want to face a nuclear war, Russia would have no reason to feel unsafe in modern times. Unsafe for a large-scale invasion, that is. And this does not even include the fact that modern Western democracies are not likely to do direct military intervention against Russia in any case, as that would probably be very unpopular among the voters. That is, unless they are attacked first by Russia. And also expanding into other countries' territory and taking them over in order to protect one's own country would also mean that you have a lot of hostile local people under you that can erupt in rebellion when you get invaded. And those things were easier to keep under control in the past than it is today with modern communication and access to information. So just expanding in order to increase one's own defensive buffer would not be a good idea in the modern world in the same way it was in the past. Another thing that points towards Russia not being interested in choke points is that Russia, which Peter Zeihan has ignored, has shown aggression outside of these gaps, such as threatening Swedish airspace, and made commentaries about invading Gotland, which is outside of these gaps, this little island here, and have also made threats against Denmark and the island of Bornholm when politicians were stationed there. This sort of aggression is also not a good idea if you feel threatened, as that would just create more tension and increase the likelihood of being attacked, as these small-scale aggressions are not big enough in order to act as a deterrent, really. They are rather just incursions that seems more likely to be probing operations in order to test the defenses of various Western countries. Then we have also the fact that if Russia really wanted to close these gaps, as Peter Zeihan said, then it would have been easier to begin with the gaps in Central Asia, as they would not have been contested by Western states initially as much as was the case with Ukraine, that is closer to the West, and thus would have been easier targets. However, these targets would have been poorer or not as valuable as conquests if you are doing more traditionalist imperialist expansion. And thus I think it's much more likely that Russia is just being imperialistic here. And another evidence that points towards gaps not being the explanation for Russian aggression is that if it was such a vital issue for the survival of the Russian state, as Peter Zeihan predicts, then Russia would have called general mobilization already against Ukraine, because they cannot lose this war if it is about these gaps, if these gaps are so vital, as Peter Zeihan claims. Peter Zeihan, like Mearsheimer, who I'm going to discuss in a future video, stay tuned for that one, folks, ignores that Russia has a history of being imperialist by itself, and expansionism has other factors also involved. And he also misapplies these theories that were designed for another era into the modern era, ignoring nukes and modern communication and information spread, which will change the face of war. Of course, it could still be that Russia still acts with assumptions from the early 20th century. However, I find this highly unlikely considering Russia's general tendency towards imperialism historically, and how people such as Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, and widely regarded as having been a puppet for Putin, in his mails have talked about restoring the Russian Empire, which points towards historical revanchism or an historical desire to return to being a great empire. And these examples I've mentioned here about why this is not about gaps or about geography for Russia in being expansionistic shows why you can't apply historical theories of the past to the present uncritically without considering if any factors have changed or if there are other factors that are more likely to lie behind various behaviors and actions of various political actors. In today's world, remember this when you hear someone discussing history as if it applies today. And be critical if there is anything that doesn't make sense or seems to make sense, because there could be factors that have changed. And on the subject of questioning things, my dear viewers, I would love to hear your comments, and if you disagree with me or agree with me, as I love hearing your opinions and having discussions with you, just as much as I would like you to like my video. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.